He wanted to save his people from poverty, but 30 million died of hunger. He wanted to give them freedom, but he built a massive prison. This is the story of a man who, in his attempt to build a heaven on earth, created a literal hell. Mao Zedong was the man who raised China from the ashes of war and poverty. But on that path, his hands became more stained with blood than perhaps any other ruler in human history. He transformed a helpless, humiliated nation into a global superpower. He saved millions from illiteracy, gave women equal rights, and brought healthcare to the most remote villages. Yet, this progress came at a staggering, horrific price. Mao used fear and violence to drive his policies, and he strangled every dissenting voice in its infancy. He recruited a generation of Chinese youth to kill in his name, and built a regime where he was worshipped as a god. His policies led to the deadliest famine in the history of our species. Historians estimate he is responsible for the deaths of 40 to 80 million people. Mao's story is the story of the razor-thin line between ambition and madness. It is the story of a leader who may have begun with noble intentions, but in the pursuit of his goals, forgot his humanity and became the very monster he sought to destroy. History is in the headlines, but the truth, that's hidden in the profiles. Welcome to Profile. Subscribe to join our community of curious minds. Mao Zedong, or as he is written in older texts, Mao Zedong, was born on December 26, 1893, in China's Hunan province. His childhood coincided with the Century of Humiliation, a period where European powers and Japan invaded China, seized its lands, took trade concessions by force, and demanded heavy reparations. In those days, disease, starvation, and rebellion swept across China. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for 250 years, was on the brink of total collapse. Mao, however, was born into a relatively prosperous family. His father was a wealthy farmer who could afford his son's education. From childhood, Mao was fascinated by books and the pursuit of knowledge. Yet, even as a teenager, he was at odds with ancient Chinese traditions. At 14, when his father arranged a forced marriage for him, he fled his home. He was determined to continue his studies, and despite his father's insistence that he work on the farm, he eventually achieved his wish. At 18, he set out for the city of Changsha, a city that was the epicenter of revolutionary activity. There, he witnessed the cruelties of the imperial government firsthand. Gradually, he became interested in politics. He participated in secret revolutionary meetings, and radical ideas began to take shape within him. When the rebellion against the Chinese Empire began in 1911, Mao joined the Revolutionary Army, though he never actually participated in a battle. The revolution succeeded and the monarchy fell, but the new government, the Republic of China, shattered the hopes of Mao and millions of others. Violence, corruption, and injustice continued in the new system, and soon warlords seized control of the country. Still searching for a way to save China, Mao went to Beijing in 1918. It was there that he was introduced to new revolutionary ideas that would transform the course of his life. In Beijing, he discovered communism. He read the works of Karl Marx with feverish passion, and the news of the Russian Revolution's victory filled him with wonder. Gradually, he came to the belief that communism was the healing prescription that could rescue China from the claws of war and exploitation and unite it once again. Mao quickly found a special place among the communists. When the Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921, he was one of its founding members. This was the start of a 30-year journey that would eventually bring him to power, a path filled with violence, struggle, and a civil war that would fundamentally change Mao himself. In the beginning, Mao worked for the party with immense enthusiasm. He organized workers, led strikes, and formed labor unions. Unlike many of his comrades who focused solely on urban workers, Mao realized that the peasants, who made up the vast majority of China's population, could be the primary force of the revolution. But an unexpected event changed everything. The Communist Party had allied itself with a larger party called the Kuomintang, a decision that later came at a terrible cost. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, suddenly turned against his communist allies. On April 12, 1927, he ordered the Shanghai Massacre. Thousands of communists were cut down and drowned in blood in the streets of the city. A wave of violence quickly engulfed the entire country. Thousands were killed, and the Communist Party stood on the brink of total annihilation. In 1928, Chiang Kai-shek seized control of all of China, and Mao and his companions were forced to flee to remote regions. This was the beginning of China's 20-year civil war. This period fundamentally transformed Mao. The man who was once an idealistic youth who avoided violence was now tempered in the furnace of war. Kuomintang forces ruthlessly hunted communists, carrying out mass killings in the areas under their control. Personal blows also struck him, one after another. His second wife was arrested and executed, and his 4-year-old son died shortly after. Mao, constantly exposed to the threat of destruction, gradually became a ruthless leader. In the early 1930s, he ordered bloody purges within the party. Anyone suspected of betrayal was tortured and executed. This was only the beginning of the violence that China would see during Mao's reign. In 1934, as Mao approached his 40th year, a golden opportunity to lead the Communist Party arrived. Kuomintang forces had surrounded the Communists in their bases. The only way to survive was a massive retreat, the Long March, which became one of the legends of Chinese history. This 5,000-mile march through China's most impassable regions began with heavy casualties. In the first months, more than half of the forces perished. It was in these critical conditions that Mao took command. With his considerable military experience, he managed to lead the remaining forces safely out of the death trap. The Long March became an epic in the history of Chinese communism. Mao's forces crossed the toughest mountain passes, fought in more than 200 battles, and achieved astonishing victories. When the march ended in 1935, Mao had become the undisputed leader of the party. He formalized this position in 1943 by being appointed chairman of the Communist Party, a position he held until the end of his life. Chiang Kai-shek was so preoccupied with destroying the communists that he neglected the threat from the east. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and forced humiliating concessions from Chiang. Concessions he had no choice but to accept because all his attention was focused on fighting the communists. Mao saw this as an opportunity to expand his popular influence. The communists had declared war on Japan since 1932, and this firm stance attracted many who were fed up with the Kuomintang's inaction. In 1937, Chiang had no choice but to sign a peace treaty with Mao and unite with him to confront the Japanese invaders. Suddenly, the communists were no longer a small group of radicals. They were now a legal party with a national role in defending the country. As the war continued, the popularity of the communists increased rapidly. By the time of Japan's defeat in 1945, Mao held command over an army of nearly 900,000 men, 20 times his original forces. In contrast, the Kuomintang forces emerged from the battle exhausted and demoralized. When the Civil War resumed in 1945, they were broken with startling speed. By 1949, the communists had seized control of the country, and Chiang Kai-shek fled to the island of Taiwan, where the Kuomintang remains a political force to this day. On October 1st, 1949, Mao stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. At 55 years old, he had become the absolute leader of nearly 500 million people, 1/5 of the world's population. Mao, now holding the reins of power, launched an ambitious program to modernize China and eradicate its ancient traditions. In the beginning, many Chinese people witnessed an improvement in their standards of living. When the communists came to power, only 20% of the population was literate. Mao launched massive literacy campaigns, and by 1976, the literacy rate had reached 70%. Healthcare, especially in rural areas, improved significantly. Health education programs for villagers led to an increase in life expectancy and a sharp decrease in infant mortality. Women gained more rights, including the right to divorce and job opportunities equal to those of men. Mao also banned forced marriage, the very same ancient tradition he had fought against in his own youth. But while standards of living were rising for some, for others, the situation only grew worse. Mao exercised a suffocating control over the thoughts and actions of his citizens. He became consumed by a cult of personality, using censorship, mass media, and propaganda to create a culture of worship that portrayed him as a heroic and infallible leader. His writings were taught in every school, buildings were named in his honor, and his image was installed in homes and public spaces across the entire country. Mao utilized this absolute power to its fullest. He often traveled with large groups of young women and engaged in numerous relationships. His word was the law, and anyone who spoke against him or his policies was either arrested or forced into a humiliating self-criticism. Public confessions in which they had to explain why their opposition to him had been a grave mistake. Soon, waves of purges began to eliminate the so-called undesirable elements of society. Landowners and capitalists were either executed, driven to suicide, or sent to forced labor camps known as the Laogai. In these camps, prisoners were to be re-educated through hard labor and subjected to thought reform, psychological techniques designed to annihilate their previous identities. Every form of independent thought was strictly suppressed. Intellectuals, who were considered the greatest threat to independent thinking, were the primary targets. To identify them, Mao launched the 100 Flowers campaign, encouraging people to criticize the government. He said, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." But in reality, it was a trap. Anyone who dared to express a dissenting opinion was arrested. More than 500,000 people were exiled to the countryside or sent to labor camps. But Mao's ambitions went far beyond controlling minds. He wanted China to overtake the West in agriculture and industry. In 1958, he launched the Great Leap Forward, a program he believed could achieve these goals. Mao's understanding of economics and agriculture was fatally flawed. However, party officials, terrified by the purges, did not dare to question his judgment. The result was a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. China's rural population, over 500 million people, were gathered into people's communes. In these communes, people were forced to eat, sleep, and work together to increase productivity. Private farming, which was seen as a sign of capitalism, was strictly banned. Personal farms and livestock were confiscated without any compensation. Those who did not join the communes voluntarily or tried to escape were subjected to struggle sessions, where they were physically abused and humiliated to serve as a warning to others. Local party officials, terrified of failing to meet the set targets, often forced peasants to work long hours in horrific conditions. Production statistics were routinely forged to match Mao's constantly increasing goals. To reach steel production targets, the people were encouraged to set up backyard iron smelting furnaces. At the peak of this program, about 90 million people, 1/4 of China's active population, abandoned their primary jobs to participate. People melted down their cooking pots, their bicycles, and even their farming tools in these furnaces. But the steel produced was of such poor quality that party officials were forced to secretly discard it. Simultaneously, Mao launched the Four Pests campaign, encouraging the people to kill sparrows and other pests. But the elimination of sparrows had the opposite effect. The insect population, especially locusts, exploded and ravaged the crops. Mao's disastrous policies, combined with droughts and floods, led to the largest famine in human history. It is estimated that between 30 and 50 million people died. Instead of correcting his course, Mao made the situation worse. He continued to increase production targets and refused to change his policies until it was far too late. He even banned the use of the word famine. Those who stole or hid food just to survive were branded with hot irons, beaten to death, or buried alive. To solidify his power, Mao needed an external enemy just as much as he needed internal control. He spoke constantly of the dangers of Western imperialism and capitalism. This ever-present foreign threat served two vital functions. It distracted the public from the crushing internal problems, and it allowed the government to accuse any dissenting voice of conspiring with the enemy. He instilled in the Chinese people the idea that any moment of negligence could lead to the return of colonial forces and a repeat of the century of humiliation. This perpetual fear kept the people united around his leadership, making them believe that the nation's survival depended on unquestioning obedience to the great leader. Mao skillfully exploited the bitter memories of past humiliations, the defeat in the Opium Wars, and the occupation of Chinese lands by Western powers and Japan to stir nationalist emotions. He presented himself as the only leader capable of protecting China from these threats. Even when critics spoke of economic hardships or food shortages, Mao accused them of falling for enemy propaganda and weakening the national spirit. In this way, any criticism, no matter how constructive, could be framed as a sign of treason. This policy was so successful that even at the height of the Great Leap Forward famine, many Chinese people continued to blame foreign powers for their suffering rather than the disastrous domestic policies. When the Soviet Union criticized Mao's radicalism, he even added his own communist ally to the list of enemies, calling them traitorous revisionists. This showed that to maintain his internal grip on power, Mao was willing to sacrifice even his most important international alliance. Only in 1961, when the scale of the catastrophe could no longer be hidden, did Mao allow his policies to change. The tragedy had dealt a heavy blow to his political credibility, and dissenting voices rose throughout the Communist Party. In January 1962, at a decisive event known as the 7,000-Man Conference, Mao's deputy, Liu Shaoqi, finally dared to criticize the great leader. With the support of other party leaders, he pointed to Mao's extreme policies as the cause of the disaster. Mao, sensing his declining popularity, decided on a tactical retreat. He had already resigned from the post of state president in April 1959, although he remained the chairman of the Communist Party. The executive control of the country fell to Liu Shaoqi as president and Deng Xiaoping as the party's general secretary. These two pragmatic leaders, understanding the depth of the catastrophe, adopted more moderate policies. They allowed farmers to keep a portion of their crops, reduced the size of the people's communes, and even allowed a limited free market to operate. They focused on expertise and efficiency rather than pure ideology. But Mao never intended to relinquish power permanently. Displeased with the market reforms and his loss of influence, he secretly plotted his comeback. The opportunity for this return arrived in 1966. Now 72 years old, Mao was ready to reclaim his absolute control. To prove his physical health and announce his return to the political stage, he famously swam in China's longest river, the Yangtze. To consolidate his power, he decided to launch a mass movement, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. In this movement, he mobilized the youth of China to destroy anything he perceived as opposition. These students and pupils, who later became known as the Red Guards, had grown up in an environment filled with Maoist propaganda, and many followed him with a religious zeal. They always carried a copy of the Little Red Book, a collection of Mao's writings and speeches, which was regarded as the ultimate source of knowledge. One politician of that era famously remarked, "Comrade Mao is a genius. One sentence of his is worth 10,000 of ours." Mao easily mobilized these fanatical followers against his enemies. On August 18, 1966, he held a massive rally in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, where more than 1 million Red Guards participated. He encouraged them to attack anyone who seemed to oppose him, especially those in positions of authority. The stage was set for a decade of chaos that would tear China apart. What followed was Red August, a wave of slaughter in Beijing during which more than 10,000 people were murdered for the crime of suspected opposition to Mao. Entire families were massacred simply because they belonged to the wrong social class. The elderly and the young, even infants, were not spared. It is reported that the youngest victim was only 38 days old. Violence quickly spread across the country. Traditional authority figures, especially teachers, were the first victims. Many were tortured or beaten to death. Others were dragged to mass criticism sessions, where they were humiliated before crowds. Their heads were shaved, and ink was poured over their faces before they were beaten with wooden clubs and belts. Mao utilized every means to support this chaos. He established a transport network and gave the Red Guards free train tickets so they could spread the violence nationwide. He ordered the police not to interfere with their actions. Schools and universities were closed so that students could devote their entire time to the revolution. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, the politicians who had held power in Mao's absence, were purged. Liu died after prolonged torture, and Deng fled to the countryside after the Red Guards threw his son from a 3-story building, leaving him paralyzed for life. The Red Guards were tasked with destroying the last vestiges of traditional Chinese culture, specifically what they called the 4 olds: old ideas, old customs, old habits, and old culture. China's historical heritage came under direct assault. They looted temples, destroyed artworks, desecrated cemeteries, burned books, and toppled statues. A vast portion of China's 1,000-year history was lost forever. Even the Forbidden City, the magnificent symbol of Chinese civilization, was nearly destroyed by Red Guards armed with pickaxes. Only the timely arrival of an army battalion sent to protect it saved this historical treasure. The 4 olds were to be replaced by the 4 news: new ideas, new customs, new habits, and new culture. But in reality, this meant only Mao's thoughts were allowed to exist. Mao became a sacred figure. In workplaces, people stood before his portrait every morning and evening, bowing 3 times to seek guidance. They thanked him before every meal. Official letters began with his quotes. People were forced to perform the loyalty dance to prove their devotion. It was claimed that the Little Red Book could perform miracles, making the blind see, the deaf hear, and it was even reported that Maoism had raised the dead. Eventually, the country descended into total anarchy. The Red Guards, having run out of targets, turned on each other. Rival factions formed, accusing one another of being counter-revolutionaries. Many experienced the same torture and humiliation they had once inflicted on others. Some provinces reached the brink of civil war as extremist groups stole military weapons and bombarded each other's positions with artillery and anti-aircraft guns. Only in 1968, 2 years after the chaos began, did Mao finally decide to restore order and send the military to deal with the rebel groups. Although the Cultural Revolution continued in a diluted form until Mao's death in 1976, its destructive impact on Chinese society was incalculable. While exact figures are unknown, it is estimated that millions lost their lives, and millions more suffered permanent physical or psychological damage. The Red Guards were also victims. These young people, brainwashed by a lifetime of propaganda, had committed murder in the name of their great leader, only to be deprived of their vital years of education. Youth unemployment became a severe national crisis. But Mao showed no sympathy for those who had killed in his name. He launched a campaign that sent millions of former Red Guards to the countryside to cause less trouble. They were forced to integrate with the peasants and learn the reality of manual labor. Most had a miserable experience. Many of these young people grew disillusioned with Mao, seeing how they had been used as pawns and then discarded. As Mao entered his 80s, he still held immense political power. He negotiated with foreign powers and maintained his iron grip on Chinese politics. But by the early 1970s, his health began to rapidly decline. He no longer resembled the powerful leader of the past. He suffered from multiple illnesses and required help to sit, stand, or walk. He was partially paralyzed, nearly blind, and could barely speak. Oxygen tanks were installed in his cars, his rooms, and at every podium where he might give a speech. Rival groups within the government, seeing his death approach, began lining up for the succession. But even in this weakened state, Mao played these groups against each other, purging anyone who seemed a serious threat. In the mid-1970s, his body could not withstand a series of heart attacks. Finally, in the early hours of September 9, 1976, at the age of 82, Mao Zedong passed away. But the future of China did not unfold as he had imagined. His wife, Jiang Qing, was arrested after a failed attempt to seize power. In a stunning twist of history, Deng Xiaoping, the very man Mao had purged during the Cultural Revolution, emerged as the leader of China. Deng did what seemed impossible during Mao's lifetime. He criticized the great leader, announcing that Mao was 70% correct and 30% wrong. He maintained the Communist Party's monopoly on power, but launched massive reforms. The core of Deng's reforms was the economy. Just as Mao had feared, he brought capitalism to China. China remained communist in name, but in practice, it took the capitalist road. Agriculture was decollectivized, price controls were lifted, foreign investment was welcomed, and for the first time, entrepreneurs were allowed to start their own businesses. Contrary to Mao's predictions, the majority of the Chinese people welcomed Deng's reforms. Economic growth and job opportunities skyrocketed. Per capita income tripled between 1978 and 1994. GDP quadrupled, and by the time of Deng's death in 1997, China's economy had become one of the largest in the world. Over 850 million people were lifted out of poverty. Mao's dream of turning China into an economic superpower was finally realized, but not through the great leap forward he had envisioned, but by embracing the very capitalist system he had spent his life fighting against. Today, Mao's legacy in China is complex. The Communist Party still hails him as a hero of the revolution, but it has rejected almost all of his economic policies. His image still hangs over the Tiananmen Gate, and his body remains in a mausoleum in the same square, a permanent reminder of the turbulent era from which modern China was born. Mao's story shows how noble ideals can lead to human catastrophes. He who once rose to save his people from poverty and oppression became a dictator who sent millions to their deaths. Yet, China today, with all its contradictions, is the product of the revolution he led. A revolution that took a path completely different from the one he intended. What is your judgment on Mao Zedong? Was he a visionary who paved the way for China's greatness, or a monster who lost his humanity in the pursuit of power? Every story has two sides, and the truth usually lies somewhere in the shadows. We want to hear your perspective. Join the discussion in the comments below. If this profile gave you a new perspective, support our mission with a like and share. Thank you for being part of the Profile community. Until next time, stay curious.